Imagine walking into a room. You aren't looking at anyone specifically, but you instantly map the emotional temperature. You register the micro expressions, the tight jaw of the person by the door, the slightly forced laughter in the corner, the sudden drop in heart rate variance of someone who just felt slighted. Now, imagine you don't just observe these baseline shifts, you absorb them. It becomes your operational reality. This is the daily existence of the highly empathetic individual. They are the ultimate biological sensors, reading data points that 99% of the population completely misses. They give, they buffer, they adapt, and they absorb. But then, a shift occurs. It isn't loud. It doesn't come with an ultimatum, a slammed door, or a fiery confrontation. It is a sudden, absolute, chilling silence. Most people mistake this silence for a phase. They assume the empath is just tired, taking a breather, or playing a tactical game of withdrawal to gain leverage. They think, give it a few days, they'll come around. That is the single most dangerous miscalculation you can make in human dynamics. When a true empath goes quiet, you are not witnessing a pause. You are witnessing an execution. They have crossed a psychological line of no return called the empathic burnout threshold. In behavioral analysis, we look at indicators, the precise moment a subject stops leaking emotional microsignals and completely flattens their affect. When that happens to an empath, the emotional engine hasn't just stalled, it has been systematically dismantled and removed from the chassis. They have run the cost-benefit analysis of trying to save the connection, and the math has definitively returned a zero. Why should you stay tuned to every second of this breakdown? Because understanding this mechanism isn't just about understanding empaths, it's about protecting your own survival in your relationships, your business negotiations, and your life. If you don't know how to spot the invisible metrics leading up to this silence, you will wake up one day to find the most loyal, high-value asset in your life has vanished while standing right in front of you. You will be left talking to a ghost, completely blind to the fact that you drove them to pull the plug. Let's dissect exactly what happens when the human radar goes dark, and why, once the silence sets in, it is already too late. Look at the person sitting next to you. Observe their posture, the tilt of their head, the tension in their shoulders. Most people see a body. An empath sees a broadcast. They are wired to feel the invisible currents of human emotion. But what happens when the broadcast suddenly cuts to black? Most people think the most dangerous person in a room is the loudest one, the one making threats, throwing tantrums, or aggressively dominating the space. They are completely wrong. In the world of behavioral profiling, the loudest person is the most predictable. They are leaking data, flashing their vulnerabilities, and begging for control. The most dangerous element in any human system is the sudden, calculated absence of signal. It's the person who used to care, who used to read your every mood, who used to bend over backwards to fix the friction, suddenly turning into a stone wall. If you are currently experiencing this silence from someone in your life, or if you want to make sure you never trigger it, you cannot afford to blink during this presentation. We are going to expose the mechanics of the empathic door slam. By the end of this, you will realize that when an empath goes quiet, the negotiation isn't stalled. It is already over. To understand the silence, you have to understand the baseline. An empath operates at a hyper-vigilant level of emotional intelligence. They don't just notice that you're having a bad day. Their nervous system actively tries to balance the room for you. They offer micro-smiles, ask the right questions, and absorb your toxic runoff just to keep the peace. Because they do this so naturally, the people around them develop a fatal cognitive bias. They begin to view this infinite emotional giving as a permanent fixture, like gravity or the sunrise. They think, I can push them, I can neglect them, I can take from them because that's just who they are. They will always absorb it. What they don't see is the internal pressure gauge. Every time an empath tolerates disrespect, matches coldness with warmth, or forgives a boundary violation without seeing a change in behavior, the needle moves closer to the red zone. They are running a silent, continuous appraisal of the relationship's viability. The transition from a hyper-giving empath to a completely silent one doesn't happen in stages. It happens like a circuit breaker tripping. 1 second the lights are on, and the next, you are standing in pitch darkness. In behavioral analysis, we look for the moment a subject shifts from active coping to absolute detachment. When an empath reaches their breaking point, what Daniel Goleman's research implies as the terminal state of emotional exhaustion, the brain undergoes a radical shift. The amygdala, worn out from constant empathy, triggers a profound psychological self-defense mechanism, complete emotional numbing. They stop arguing, they stop correcting you, they stop defending themselves or asking for what they need. Why? Because arguing requires an investment of energy, and their internal calculator has just realized that investing even one more calorie of energy into you will yield a negative return. The silence you are hearing isn't an emotional reaction. It is a calculated allocation of remaining assets. They have chosen self-preservation over your validation. This is the part that catches people completely off guard. When an ordinary person gives you the silent treatment, it's usually a tactical play. It's an aggressive maneuver designed to make you feel guilty, run after them, and beg for forgiveness. It is an invitation to play a game. An empath's silence is not a game. It is a funeral. They aren't quiet because they want you to notice and change. They are quiet because they have already accepted that you won't change. The decision has been finalized in the quiet theater of their own mind. When you try to apologize, win them back, or use your old emotional leverage, you will find that none of your buttons work anymore. Why? Because they didn't just walk away from you. They completely uninstalled the software that allowed them to care about your opinion. You can stand in front of them, pull out all your old tricks, or try to spark a reaction. But all you will receive is a polite, vacant look. You have been demoted from a primary emotional partner to a generic stranger. If you have an empath in your life, whether it's a spouse, a business partner, or a lifelong friend, do not mistake their patience for blindness. Do not assume that because they tolerate your rough edges today, they will accept them tomorrow. They see every microexpression, they log every broken promise, and they feel every ounce of your indifference. If they are still talking to you, still fighting with you, or still trying to fix things, congratulations. You are still in the game. You still have time to pivot, change your behavior, and fix the baseline. But if the air has suddenly gone cold, if the text messages have turned into one-word status reports, and if the eyes that used to read your soul are now looking right through you, do not bother drafting an apology. The case is closed. The emotional ledger has been burned. When the human radar goes quiet, pack your bags, because the relationship is already over. The fundamental flaw in how people read human behavior lies in a concept behavioral analysts call the baseline illusion. Every individual possesses a behavioral baseline, a unique composite of vocal tones, gesture frequencies, microexpressions, and emotional output that represents their standard resting state. When you deal with a highly empathetic individual, their baseline is radically different from the rest of the population. Their default setting is one of continuous emotional leakage. They actively broadcast warmth, offer intuitive nods of validation, adjust their body language to mirror yours, and subtly alter their vocal syntax to make you feel secure. Because this elevated emotional output is present from the very first moment you meet them, your brain instantly logs it as their permanent, unchangeable standard. You commit a profound error in attribution. You mistake a highly demanding, energy-consuming psychological choice for a passive, effortless personality trait. You assume that because they are giving, they cannot help but give. This illusion creates a dangerous blind spot in relationships, business partnerships, and social dynamics. When someone is constantly smoothing over the rough edges of a conversation, laughing at poorly timed jokes, or absorbing the toxic ambient stress in a room just to keep the peace, the people around them stop viewing that effort as a gift. Instead, they view it as an entitlement. They become cognitively blind to the sheer volume of psychological currency the empath is spending just to maintain that baseline. In the realm of behavioral profiling, we know that any baseline sustained at such a high operational cost is inherently unstable over long periods without reciprocity. Yet because the empath's outward projection remains warm and accommodating, you assume everything is perfectly fine. You miss the subtle, invisible degradation of the signal. The illusion convinces you that you have an infinite runway to act carelessly, project your frustrations, or withhold validation, because the empath's baseline appears indestructible. You fail to realize that the warmth they are projecting is no longer coming from an abundant surplus. It is being drawn directly from their core reserves. As those reserves deplete, the empath doesn't immediately start screaming or throwing tantrums. Remember, their baseline is conflict avoidant and harmony seeking. Instead, they quietly begin to ration their energy. The micro-validation becomes slightly less frequent. The smile doesn't reach the eyes quite as fast. The enthusiastic follow-up questions shift into polite, standard responses. To an untrained observer, these minor deviations are completely invisible because they are masked by the lingering facade of the old baseline. You look at them and think they are just having a slow day or feeling a bit tired. You don't see the systemic structural failure happening beneath the surface. You don't see that the biological sensor is running out of power. The danger of the baseline illusion is that it completely insulates you from reality until it is far too late to course correct. By taking their elevated emotional output for granted, you treat the empath like an appliance that simply runs in the background, never imagining a scenario where the power grid shuts down entirely. You become conditioned to a level of psychological comfort that is being subsidized entirely at their expense, remaining totally oblivious to the fact that every unreciprocated interaction is silently chipping away at the foundation of the connection until the entire structure is resting on nothing but dust. Behind the warm, accommodating exterior of a highly empathetic person lies a sophisticated, hyper-vigilant cognitive framework that operates like an invisible ledger. While the world views the empath as a selfless, unconditional giver, behavioral psychology reveals a far more complex reality. No human brain is wired to endure continuous emotional depletion without evaluating safety and reciprocity. The empath's mind is constantly running a background program, silently logging data points from every interaction you have with them. This ledger doesn't track material things or transactional favors. It tracks emotional equity, psychological safety, and mutual respect. Every time they absorb your stress, validate your insecurities, or overlook a moment of thoughtless cruelty, a new entry is made. They are evaluating whether the relationship is a mutual partnership or a one-way extraction. Because empaths possess a naturally high tolerance for emotional discomfort, they will allow the ledger to run a massive deficit for a very long time. They will repeatedly grant you emotional credits, extending loans of patience and understanding, in the hope that your baseline behavior will shift, or that you will eventually notice the imbalance and invest back into the connection. However, the human brain has hardwired biological limits to emotional spending. As you continue to draw from their reserves without making deposits, ignoring their subtle boundaries, failing to reciprocate empathy, or treating their kindness as a weakness to be exploited, the internal ledger shifts from a state of manageable deficit into a definitive diagnosis of a toxic, non-recoverable asset. In behavioral profiling, this is the exact moment the subject shifts from a strategy of active investment to one of total risk mitigation. The empath's brain realizes that any further emotional capital poured into this specific relationship is a total loss. This realization is purely analytical, occurring deep beneath the surface of their conscious desire to be helpful. Once the ledger determines that a relationship has zero probability of returning to an equitable state, the psychological machinery changes instantly. They don't trigger an emotional bankruptcy alarm, nor do they present you with a line-item bill of your past offenses to demand immediate payment. Instead, they silently write off the debt entirely, along with the relationship itself. The ledger closes, the account is permanently shuttered, and all emotional funding is cut off in an instant. The terrifying nature of this invisible ledger is that by the time you finally realize something is wrong, the audit has already concluded and the decision is final. You are left completely unaware that while you thought you were successfully getting away with neglect or manipulation, every single interaction was being weighed, measured, and found wanting on a scale you couldn't even see. To understand the devastating nature of this psychological shift, you must learn to distinguish between standard emotional manipulation and the precise behavioral phenomenon known as the empathic door slam. When an ordinary person feels slighted, neglected, or hurt in a relationship, their typical defense mechanism is a tactical withdrawal. They use silence as an active weapon, a form of relational aggression designed to elicit a specific behavior from you. They want you to notice their absence, feel the weight of their disapproval, experience anxiety over the rift, and ultimately come running back to beg for forgiveness. In behavioral profiling, this is classified as an attention-seeking leverage play. The silence is loud, heavy, and deliberately calibrated to maintain a tether between both parties. It is a demand for pursuit. The empathic door slam, however, operates on an entirely different psychological plane. When an empath goes quiet, it is never a tactical maneuver, a plea for attention, or an attempt to manipulate you into changing your behavior. It is the absolute permanent cessation of emotional investment. The difference lies entirely in intent. Tactical silence wants to punish you to change the dynamic, while the empathic door slam simply erases the dynamic altogether. They have reached a point of psychological exhaustion where they no longer have the energy or the desire to manipulate, punish, or even educate you on what went wrong. The silence is clean, cold, and entirely devoid of emotional resonance because the tether has been completely severed. They are not pulling away to make you chase them. They are pulling away because they have already moved on in the quietest corridors of their mind. When you try to engage with someone executing a tactical withdrawal, you will feel the heat of their resentment, the friction of their anger, or the underlying desperation for resolution. But when you stand in front of an empath who has slammed the door, you will feel an unsettling, absolute vacuum. There is no anger to argue against, no resentment to soothe, and no hidden test for you to pass. They will answer your direct questions with polite, superficial efficiency, but the profound emotional access you once enjoyed is permanently locked away. They have looked at the relationship, realized that the cost of maintaining it is destroying their own psychological well-being, and made a rational, non-negotiable decision to terminate the contract. They do not hold a grudge, because holding a grudge requires keeping you alive in their emotional ecosystem. Instead, they choose complete neutrality. The absolute finality of this state catches people completely off guard, because they are conditioned to look for the warning signs of standard relationship conflict, screaming, crying, ultimatums, or dramatic exits. Because the empath gives none of these theatrical cues, you assume the silence is just a temporary rough patch you can eventually navigate or ignore. You treat it like a minor tactical freeze that will thaw out with a little time or a cheap apology. You fail to comprehend that this silence is the sound of a vault locking shut from the inside, and no amount of bargaining, guilt-tripping, or emotional counter-manipulation will ever turn the key again. In the discipline of behavioral profiling, the moment an individual crosses their psychological threshold, they enter what is known as the flat affect danger zone. Under normal circumstances, an empath is defined by their high emotional volatility and rich micro-expressive output. Their faces are an open book of microscopic cues, displaying empathy, concern, and intense engagement with every word you speak. They leak emotional data constantly because their mirror neurons are hyperactive, instinctively reflecting your internal state back at you to create rapport and safety. However, when the psychological circuit breaker trips and the empathic door slam is executed, this entire expressive apparatus goes completely dark. The flat affect is characterized by a sudden, chilling neutralization of all facial expressions, vocal inflections, and emotional responsiveness. Their voice loses its melodic warmth and drops into a flat, steady, monotone cadence. Their eyes, which once locked onto yours with deep, intuitive understanding, suddenly assume a glassy, detached neutrality. They are looking at you, but they are no longer seeing a partner, a friend, or an emotional entity. They are observing you as if you were a piece of furniture or a static data point in their environment. This state is a profound indicator that a total structural collapse of emotional attachment has occurred within their neural architecture. In behavioral analysis, a flat affect typically signals severe trauma or neurological shutdown. But in a push-to-the-limit empath, it represents a highly controlled defensive dissociation from a toxic source. They have effectively severed the neural pathways that allowed your actions, words, or presence to impact their emotional state. The danger of this zone is that the untrained eye often misinterprets this absolute neutrality as a positive sign, assuming that because the empath is no longer crying, complaining, or showing signs of stress, the relationship has entered a calmer, more stable phase. People think, finally, the drama is over, and they are listening to reason. This is a catastrophic misreading of the baseline shift. In reality, the absence of friction doesn't mean the relationship is healed. It means the relationship has deceased and the body has gone cold. The empath is no longer fighting you because there is nothing left inside them worth fighting for. They have withdrawn all their emotional stakes from the table. If you try to provoke them, provoke anger, or trigger guilt to see if the old person is still in there, you will be met with a terrifyingly calm, unbothered wall of indifference. They will not snap, they will not retaliate, and they will not seek revenge. They will simply watch your emotional display with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing an experiment. This flat affect is the behavioral signature of complete psychological closure, an empirical demonstration that you have been entirely deleted from their emotional ecosystem, leaving behind a vacant, hollow shell of formal politeness that no amount of heat, pressure, or desperation can ever reanimate. The ultimate destination of this psychological evolution is the irreversibility of the zero state. In the study of human dynamics and behavioral analysis, the zero state represents a condition of absolute neutrality where all emotional charges, both positive and negative, have been completely erased from a specific cognitive file. When a highly empathetic person reaches this terminal phase regarding a relationship, They have effectively rewritten their internal neural pathways to treat you as an absolute baseline stranger. This is the point of no return that catches narcissists, manipulators, and negligent partners completely off guard. Throughout the history of the relationship, these individuals have become accustomed to a predictable pattern of behavior. No matter how badly they behaved, how much they neglected the connection, or how deeply they wounded the empath, a combination of guilt, charm, gaslighting, or intense emotional pleading would eventually break through their defenses and restore access to their emotional reserves. They treat the relationship like an elastic band that can be stretched indefinitely without ever snapping. But the zero state is the moment the band completely snaps, and once that happens, the physics of the connection change permanently. You cannot negotiate your way out of a zero state because there is no longer any emotional currency left on the table to bargain with. When you try to apologize, offer grand gestures, or invoke the history of what you once shared together, your words will simply bounce off an impenetrable wall of absolute indifference. A standard person who is angry or resentful still possesses a powerful emotional charge toward you. Their anger is proof that they still care, that they are still invested enough to feel hurt, and that a pathway for reconciliation still exists if you can properly address that anger. The empath in a zero state is entirely empty of anger. They do not wish you harm, they do not seek revenge, and they do not hold a grudge, because carrying those feelings would require allocating precious psychological real estate to your memory. Instead, they look at you with the same clinical, detached benevolence they would extend to a random passerby on the street. The terrifying reality of this phase is that it is structurally impossible to manipulate a person who wants absolutely nothing from you. Your tears will not move them, your anger will not provoke them, and your sudden promises of radical transformation will be met with a calm, polite nod of total disinterest. They have run the final cost-benefit equation, closed the ledger, and archived the file in a secure vault deep within their subconscious mind. They have fully accepted that the version of you they loved was either an illusion or a luxury they can no longer afford without destroying themselves. By the time you notice the silence and try to scramble to fix what you broke, you are trying to revive a ghost. The neural architecture that once fired with passion, empathy, and deep devotion whenever you walked into the room has been completely overwritten, leaving you staring at a perfectly calm